Please welcome Dr. Daniël Knegt.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm honored, a bit shocked. I will try to tell you something about a topic that I've been working on for quite a while, and that has, to my surprise, but also a bit to my increasing unease, acquired more and more present-day actual meaning, and it's become more and more the center of political discussions. Fascism. First of all, I want to stress that I am an historian at the University of Amsterdam, and as a historian, I'm a bit of a weirdo, so I may at some point suppose that you know all kinds of things that you may not know, or I may go too fast, or I may use a word that you're not familiar with. Don't be afraid to raise your hand, or just your voice even, and interrupt me and ask me to clarify things, because I think that's more helpful, and otherwise I will just be shooting information at you randomly. So please take this freedom and ask questions if they urgently need to be asked. If you got more fundamental questions, you can save them for the question and the Q&A session at the end of the lecture, of course. But if it's urgent and if it has to do with something I'm saying or I'm failing to explain, please feel free. Does this work? Does this work? This works. Fascism is, there's a twofold problem with fascism. Like, on the one hand, it's a concept that escapes clear definition. There's no generally accepted definition of fascism, and there's lots of controversy on what fascism actually means. It's hard to define, it's hard to grasp it, and when you feel like you've got it, it escapes your hand like slippery soap. And on the other hand, it consists of fairly recognizable key symbols and key figures that almost everybody is familiar with, even to the extent that it is not acceptable, at least I think in many Western societies, it's considered not acceptable if you don't know who Hitler was. Not in the same way that you cannot know about Charlemagne or about Tony Blair. Not knowing what the Nazis were is considered, like having no idea at all, is considered problematic, at least in the Netherlands, but I think it goes for many European countries, and assumedly for the United States as well. So knowledge about fascism, or base knowledge about many of these symbols, I would say at least this guy you see here, Adolf Hitler, and of course one of the gates to the Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp. They are considered key symbols that have also a moral significance. Does everybody know who this guy is? It is Benito. Benito Mussolini, of course, the founder of the first fascist movement. This is by far my favorite picture of him, because he really looks like a James Bond villain here with this evil-looking cat, and it's just, that makes it the perfect picture for me. Does everybody know who these guys are? Golden Dawn. Golden Dawn, thank you very much. It's, I think, now defunct Greek far-right fascist political party that actually gained quite a few votes during the Greek debt crisis in the early 10s, if I'm not mistaken. It doesn't, I think, officially doesn't exist anymore. And it was one of the far-right parties that were not so ambivalent about their links to fascism. They embraced them, and that also shows from their flags, arguably. I mean, they, of course, maintained it was a Greek meander, but it has clear connotations with a swastika, of course. Does anybody know when this picture was taken and where? Yes, perfect. Charlottesville 2017. That was a really big, it was called the Unite the Right rally, a big demonstration, a gathering of right extremists, neo-fascists and neo-Nazis in the United States, in the town of Charlottesville, where they came together all dressed in some kind of fancy costumes. You can see here, somebody has lots of Confederate flags, there's a Nazi flag. Here there's, I think, a Greek, supposedly Greek shield, I think, what is some kind of reference to the Spartans or something. It was a very controversial moment, especially because a left-wing counter-demonstrator was killed purportedly killed by one of the far-right extremists demonstrating there. And in the aftermath of the demonstration, the then and again President Donald Trump refused to take sides. He famously declared, or notoriously declared, that there were good people on both sides, which kind of showed that he was at least accepting the support from the far right and from the extreme right in the United States. This is a far-right demonstration in Spain. And I think these pictures show a kind of fascism that many people recognize instantaneously. So this is the kind of visible recognition that fascism carries. This visible recognition makes it extremely useful in present day, and also its morally laden character makes it extremely useful in present day political struggles, present day political conflicts. I've just taken a few pictures from recent years, but I could have taken 100,000 more, showing that, like, why is it so useful? Because it carries a very big moral significance. If you call somebody a fascist or something fascist, it almost never is a neutral qualification. Like, oh, it's interesting what you're saying. You sound a bit like a fascist. It almost always means that you are discrediting someone. This is what you're saying is unacceptable. It is morally reprehensible, and it is wrong. Here, of course, you see this is a anti-Israeli demonstration in the West Bank, I think, in Palestine, like before the present-day war. It was from two or 3 years ago, I think. Here, of course, you can see the Israeli ambassador in the United Nations, who started carrying a golden Star of David as a reference, of course, to the Holocaust, in reaction to criticism of Israel in this present day and still kind of ongoing war. There's, of course, Vladimir Putin, who has been called Putler by pro-Ukrainian demonstrators. That upper left picture, is anybody familiar with that? Yeah. This is a COVID denier demonstration, or people who were demonstrating against COVID measures, and especially against QR codes, which were kind of necessary to gain access to all kinds of venues to show that you had undergone a test or been vaccinated, and comparing unvaccinated people or people who refused to have themselves tested to the Jews during the Second World War. Like, this is being put in quarantine, is like putting in a concentration camp. This is that other city that I happen to be from. It's the Dokwerker, is a famous monument for the February strike against the persecution of Jews during the Second World War, and it's still the venue of a yearly commemoration which is held there, which has been strongly associated with the left, and it generally always features anti-fascist slogans as well. People who take this heritage of the Second World War, this heritage of the resistance as an instruction for the present day from a left-wing perspective. There's all kinds of places where you find references to these symbols of fascism. And it gets more complicated because these fascist symbols play an important role in popular culture, to the extent that they've become part of pop culture to a large extent. You can recognize fascist aesthetics in clips, in memes, in many movies and in many games. Partially it is because Nazis are the perfect movie or game villains, because few people mourn Nazis or find it morally problematic to shoot them. So in this kind of really old 1990s game, Wolfenstein 3D, shooting Nazis was the unproblematic way to actually murder a lot of people. But of course, these references have also become part of internet jokes, cats that look like Hitler.com. It's still a popular website. And they've become part of blockbuster movies. From my childhood, I think The Lion King was probably my introduction to fascism was The Lion King, where the evil hyenas are led by an evil lion. and there's this scene where they all march in front of him, and it's very, very visually similar to scenes from Nazi parades. Of course, this is. Do people recognize what this movie was? What this movie was? It's not Star Wars. Dune. Thank you very much. Yeah, Dune. The other epos that I think Star Wars was kind of based on or directed from is also featuring these kind of images, and I don't think I need to explain the reference. They are very clearly seen. Another problem is that watching things about Nazis is just very, very popular. Hitler is always on TV. Every night, Hitler is on TV. It's hard to find a moment that he's not on TV, actually. And these kind of documentaries on National Geographic Channel or many other examples frequently feature Hitler and the Nazis, and people like to watch it. So the fascination is just very, very permanent, it can be said. So fascism is very present, and it is not only present in a nicely neat academic environment, but it's present all over society on all kinds of levels of seriousness. And I would argue that these things may look stupid and superficial, but they actually determine how many people look at fascism and what they know about fascism. So it's not actually possible to ignore them. They need to be addressed. They need to be part of an analysis of what fascism means to people and what people think fascism is or looks like. This is a Mussolini meme, sorry. So what are all the problems? I've now only talked about problems. I will come with some answers to these problems. Not a complete answer, I think, but some answers, some ways to address them. But I will focus on the problems first. There is no generally accepted definition of fascism. There are several definitions. There are also people who refute the idea that the definition is possible at all. And about the definitions that get put forward, there's always controversies. Or people think that they're too narrow, they're too wide, they ignore this or that aspect, and they get also all kinds of critique from all sides. And that's generally based on the conceptual vagueness. What should it include and what should it not include? How broad do you want to cast the net? Do you want to define fascism in a way that it only includes the reign of Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany? Do you want to make it a lot wider? Do you want to include more traditionalistic right-wing dictatorships like the Franco regime in Spain? Do you want to include junta regimes, for example, in Latin America in the post-war period, or also in the interwar years, actually? Do you want to actually even include Hitler? Because there's also many scholars putting forward the idea that Nazism was actually something different from fascism. And if you do that, you could even argue that fascism is just the regime of Benito Mussolini in Italy, period. If you do that, it's not a generally useful concept anymore. It's just a word to give to this specific regime. But if you do want to use fascism as an analytical category that includes several cases, I would say that you have to put the Third Reich, the National Socialist regime in Germany, in the definition of fascism. But the problem is that those two cases, Italy and Germany, actually differ from each other quite strongly on the level of the degree of control they achieved of their own country, their international power, but also on the level of the ideology. Anti-Semitism was very much at the core of National Socialism in Germany. It was not in the core of Italian fascism. Italian fascism refuted anti-Semitism for a while. Mussolini found it something outdated and ridiculous and even mocked Hitler because of it. Then they embraced it. In the late 1930s, Italian fascism also embraced anti-Semitism, but it never became the center of fascist ideology as it was in Germany. Also, the styles of leadership of the two dictators were very different. Mussolini considered himself an intellectual. He spent lots of time at the desk, writing and reading. Hitler never wrote. Well, he did write something, but he kind of dictated it to somebody else to write it for him. And he preferred the spoken word. He had a very different style, a very different expectation of what a leader should behave like, and these differences are actually hard to bridge. And then again, as you have already seen, and probably as you have known for quite a while, I'm not the first to tell you this, fascism is not a neutral concept. It is in frequent use as a political and moral swear word. So calling somebody a fascist is almost always a way to discredit them, to say what you're doing or saying is very wrong, and I put you outside of the, of putting somebody outside of what is acceptable. You can say this or that, we can disagree, but if you say this, that's fascist. Then the discussion is finished. Can you get sued for calling somebody a fascist? Maybe I should try it. I don't know. Yeah. It's would be interesting. I think not. But a defamation, that would be defamation, I think. I think there's lots of national differences in how that works out. Famous cases are more about calling somebody a Nazi, calling somebody a denier of the Holocaust, or about actual Holocaust denial. There's been some important cases in that, but yeah, you can have, there have been defamation trials about calling somebody a fascist, but I think there's lots of national difference in how that actually plays out. This means that fascism is, it's difficult to use, and it has, if you want to use it as an analytical concept, you have to take a lot of steps in order to make that possible. Just to stay on the problematic side a little bit more, I've got two very short clips that I hope work with sound and everything. The question I want to ask you is, who's the fascist, and why are they being called fascist by the speaker?
The recent arrests that our fellow citizens are now learning about are a stark reminder that this nation is at war with Islamic fascists who will use any means to destroy those of us who love freedom, to hurt our nation. The recent arrest...
Oh, yeah, that's enough, George. So who are the fascists here? Bin Laden, arguably. Saddam Hussein, yeah, by association. I think they hadn't taken that step. Maybe behind the screens they had at that time, but this is George Bush Jr. They had maybe behind the scenes taken that decision, but he says radical Islamic fascists. So it's a bit unclear who they exactly are. It's very arguably it's going to be Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, but who else? Not really clear. And why is George Bush calling them fascists? They're the villains. To justify war. I think that's a very good point. Because what do Americans do with fascists? They fight a war against them. They're fanatics. They're violent. They use violence to express their political intentions. Yeah. They oppose freedom. Yeah. I think it is all of that, and possibly also because he wants to make them into the arch enemy of what the United States stand for. And then, at that time, the word fascism was very useful to George Bush to make this big claim. This nation is at war with them. They are our mortal enemies. They're not just some kind of annoying people that we have to deal with, but they are fundamental mortal enemies of the United States. And then reaching back to the memory of the Second World War, which in American eyes was the best war ever, because it's a war that they won gloriously, and in which they were morally very much on the good side. So that's very useful to make associations with when you want to start a new war. Next fragment.
Other than our citizens, Lebowski. I don't like your jerk-off name. I don't like your jerk-off face. I don't like your jerk-off behavior. And I don't like you. Jerk-off. Do I make myself clear?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
Ow! Fucking fascist! Stay out of Malibu, Lebowski!
Does everybody know the movie? Not everybody, possibly. So who was the fascist here? And why?
Just a swear word, maybe?
Yeah, was it just a swear word? Was it completely random?
Representative of the country, like police, law enforcement.
Yeah, it's somebody wearing a uniform. Figure of authority, it's the sheriff or something, and he is violent. Like, it's maybe too obvious to expect you to actually say it, but a violent policeman wearing a uniform. That's, I think, really is actually a reference, because this movie, The Big Lebowski, I've watched it, I think, 25 times already. Cannot stop watching it, I love it. I can recommend it to everybody, and it's actually portrayed this famous figure played by Jeff Bridges, who calls himself the dude who is the quintessential old hippie who still lives in a kind of 1960s, 1970s vibe. And this idea of somebody with a uniform who's violent and authoritarian must be a fascist, that idea is very connected to the left-wing discourse from the 60s and the 70s. Anybody representing authority, repressing something, is a fascist. It's also always good to ask this question. When people mention the word fashion, when they talk about fashion, what do they actually mean? It's not always clear. To look at answers to this question, what fascism actually is, and what fascism actually means, there have been classical interpretations, actually almost as old as fascism itself. Like when the first fascist movements were founded, when the first movement was founded, I have to say in singular, by Mussolini, the left was the first to react because they were targeted by fascists. They were the first victims of fascist violence. Fascism manifested itself as a way to deal with the Red Menace, with the revolutionary threat from Italian socialism at the time. Fascists were willing to use all kinds of violent means to fight this socialist movement, and they were quite successful in doing so. So the left were the first to have a problem with fascism, and Marxists puzzled with it because the rise of fascism didn't seem to fit within their classic model of the development of society towards communism. Capitalism would collapse under its inner contradictions, after which a short period of the dictatorship of the proletariat would be followed by communist society in which all people would live peacefully and as equals. So fascism did not fit within this model, and the solution was to interpret fascism as actually a symbol of the last crisis of capitalism. Capitalism was about to succumb to its inner contradictions, and on its death throes, in its desperate bids to survive, capitalism then sacrificed freedom and democracy and liberal values, threw them in the fire, and went over to pure terror, to pure violence, in order to hold on to power just a bit longer. But if you consider fascism from that perspective, being a Marxist, it actually may be a good sign. It's regrettable, but it is a good sign that fascism actually shows up, Because it means that the revolution is not far away anymore. We don't have to wait much longer, comrades. Fascism is now on the scene. It means that our time will come, our time is really close. That's actually also made communists and socialists unable to resist the rise of fascism in Germany. After which, of course, the communist and socialist parties were banned, and their people were prosecuted and locked up, and that actually meant the end of the organized left-wing movement in 1930s Germany. So this interpretation was counterproductive, to say the least, to the left agenda. But since they had to find a way to fit it within a Marxist model, this was their answer to that. Then, around the end of the Second World War, it was very common, and also I think understandable, to consider fascism as not much of an ideology at all. Actually something which is just a vehicle for people with sadistic tendencies, who wanted an excuse to be violent, to be terrible to other people, to deny other people's humanity, and to use extreme violence against them. So fascism, if only somebody with serious psychological conditions could be a fascist. That also fitted within this idea in many countries of Europe who had been under German occupation, that collaboration was only the work of a few madmen, of a few traitors, and the rest of society had been kind of immune to this seduction of fascism, seduction of Nazism, had not affected them, and they had all kind of been in the resistance. So, like, society in a larger sense had been pure and innocent, and the victim of oppression and collaboration had only been the work of a few people who were sadists, petit bourgeois, idiots. There were all kinds of categories invented to shove them as far away from the normal folks as possible. But that does not explain why fascism did become, under certain conditions, did become attractive for millions of people, and also people from all kinds of positions in society, from old to young, from rich to poor, and from all kinds of social classes and genders. There is more to be explained than this simple idea can give. Then, during the Cold War, especially during the Cold War, totalitarianism, I hate the word, I always fail to pronounce it correctly. Totalitarianism theory found an answer by throwing communism and fascism in the same basket and fundamentally contrasting them with democratic liberal society. So, two sides of the same totalitarian coin. They both had dictators, they both had a single party, they both had the idea that they would decide everything about ordinary people's lives, and that means that there's a fundamental opposition between freedom and democracy and communism and fascism grouped together. I think the problem is that this is extremely useful in a Cold War context. But you could actually make this triangle in a different way as well. You could, if you look at it from a communist perspective, you could say fascism and liberal capitalism are actually both examples of capitalist rule, and only the Communist Party is a way to fight capitalism, and thereby to fight fascism as well. So it is too useful, it is too much linked to a political agenda, and it actually obscures many differences between communism and fascism that really do exist. It does not mean that communism is cool and okay, but it means that it's just something very different from fascism. And I would say a dictatorship, a leader, and a single party are shallower functions of a system of rule than some fundamental principles. So if you look at fascism as an ideology, as I am inclined to do, then this totalitarianism theory is not very helpful. So what can we do? What can we actually do with fascism? These classical interpretations that I've just mentioned, or tried to explain, are of little use. They all have their fundamental problems, and they fail to explain such a large-scale phenomenon as fascism was and maybe still is. Fascism is very present in discussions. It's in everybody's mouth, but no one knows what it actually means. And it has become a universally recognizable and marketable set of symbols, but devoid of context. So it's this, all these memes and all these jokes and all these references to just float in the air, or how can we make them part of something more meaningful than that? And nobody calls themselves a fascist. So fascism is something that you call somebody else. You're always somebody else's fascist. And very, very few people use the term to describe themselves. So, should we give up? No, we shouldn't give up. I think you saw this one coming. There are ways to address these problems, and one of them is the so-called new definition. It's actually not new at all. It's probably over 30 years old. It was put forward by the British political scientist Roger Griffin, and to a large extent, I tend to agree with him. Not completely, but I think most, like his interpretation, his definition of fascism has the benefit of simplicity and flexibility without being too flexible, I would say. And in his eyes, fascism can be defined with these 4 core beliefs, 4 core characteristics. And he also says that fascism is, in his heart, is an ideology, a political ideology on the same level with socialism, conservatism, liberalism. So the big ideologies from the 19th century. Fascism was born in the 20th century, but it should be put on the same level with these larger ideologies. That also means that it's a flexible phenomenon that can manifest itself in very different guises. And these core ingredients are ultranationalism, so that's probably not very surprising to I guess, to most of you. Populism, and populism here, oh, sorry, yeah? What's the difference between nationalism and ultranationalism? It just means that the nation and the national are considered to be the most important aspect of a person's allegiance. So that goes above all kinds of other allegiances. That would be my simplest answer to that. Populism here means something quite concrete. It here means the myth that the people have a single will and a single character, and that these people, or this people, actually I should use it in a singular, this organic people is being permanently betrayed by an elite. And by an elite that is not part of the people, but it is fundamentally opposed to the people and betraying the people because this elite is faithful either to foreigners, to foreign nations, or to a non-national minority within the country itself, or both. So there's a fundamental opposition between the people, considered as a unified organism, and the elite. And of course, only the populist leader or the populist party is able to represent the people, which also implies that opposition against the populist party is unlawful, or is betrayal to the people. Revolutionary dynamics means that fascists would not content themselves with simple changes, with cosmetic changes. Fascists strive for a fundamental transformation of society and of the people themselves. So there should be a new system. This whole system should be broken down, and we should have a new system with a new man living in a completely different society, in a completely different context than before. And this is linked to the idea that Roger Griffin calls palingenesis, and it's just Greek for rebirth. So this idea of national rebirth. And that's always often connected to this idea that we used to once be great, but then we became decadent, and we became weak, and we were trampled by foreigners, and we became ridiculous, and we lost our vigor, but this can be reborn. We can rise again after a long period of humiliation and failure, and fascism is supposed to bring this renewal and this rebirth. So these aspects, according to Griffin, should be the core of what fascism actually means. That also shows, I think, shows why people can be attracted to it. Like how fascism can be actually an answer to what people think are the main problems of the time. I would make it a little bit stricter by also talking about what fascists actually do. I would add the glorification of violence, or at least the large-scale acceptance of violence as a solution to all kinds of societal problems. So they should be solved, they can be solved, and they should be solved with violence. And they do not accept any limitations in their strive for political and social purity and external expansion. So fascists have the idea that any kind of opposition is illegitimate and should be crushed. If you look at fascism like this, in this way, that means that some kind of comforting ideas that it is a shallow thing, that has nothing to do with decent people, or that it is only a phenomenon of a few madmen, cannot be maintained anymore. It means that the attraction of fascism needs to be taken seriously. So it should be accepted, and we should try to understand why people can be attracted by fascism, because millions of people believed that fascism paved the way to a better future. That doesn't mean that we join them. That doesn't mean that we encourage them to do so, but we should try to at least understand its attraction, and also under which conditions, because the lack of attraction is also very much a thing. Most fascists were actually fairly unsuccessful, and there's just a few fascist movements that achieved any kind of political influence, let alone rose to power. So there's also a cliched idea that fascists are kind of unstoppable forces of nature, like 90% or even more of the fascists never got anything done. Never got out of the stage of a few angry men sitting in a bar and making big plans that never materialized. We should also look at transnational connections. How did fascists look at each other? How did they work together or fail to work together on the international scene? In the 1920s and 30s, every European country supported a fascist movement or a fascist party. There were no exceptions to that rule. So they were interested in each other. They were copying each other's strategies, styles, symbols. They were in direct touch with each other, and that is to a much larger extent true for present-day far-right and neo-fascist movements. They are very interested in each other, and they are changing ideas and strategies every day. It also means that fascism is a flexible phenomenon. It's able to adapt itself to changing circumstances and different political climates, different political cultures. It also means, and this is a long list, I'm sorry for that, this also means that fascism has cultural and intellectual dimensions that we should try to incorporate. So how do artists and intellectuals and philosophers associate themselves with fascism? And how is fascism attractive to them? Many prominent intellectuals did, and many important artists did. And fascism is less of an isolated phenomenon that we would maybe be inclined to think. It is strongly connected with other ideologies. It's strongly connected with other parties. It does not operate in a void, but it is part of a political system and a political culture with different currents, and they all relate to each other, obviously. And I think this picture is a beautiful picture from the 1933 elections, Reichstag elections in Germany. This was in a well-to-do neighborhood in Berlin, and you can see these bourgeois queuing to vote. I think one of them is actually a newspaper magnate, so it's important, a powerful man at the time, who is looking at a bunch of Nazis who are standing actually in front of the ballot box, also in a way to intimidate voters, to push them to vote for the Nazi party. And in the looks of these people, who are kind of assuming the role of bystanders, they look you can see some skepticism in their looks, maybe also aversion. but maybe also a kind of admiration. They are clearly not core supporters of the Nazi movement. It is really this picture, I think, at least in my eyes, you're free to interpret it in another way, but in my eyes, this picture says a lot about how other people related to the Nazis and also kind of accepted them at that moment, or were willing to give them a chance, with horrible consequences for the world. So fascism is not in a void. When we're talking, I am a historian, I've already told you, when we are talking about the 1930s, there's a larger picture. And the larger picture is that liberal democracy seems to be, or actually is in decline, all over Europe. In the late 1930s, it's only the north and west of Europe are still mainly consisting of liberal democratic systems, and the rest has become either authoritarian or fascist, or of course communist in the case of the Soviet Union. So it seems like, even to people who are staunch defenders of democracy, it seems like the liberal democracy is unable to address the problems of the times, and maybe it has had its days. Its days are maybe over, and maybe there's the superiority of authoritarian or fascist rule because it's more efficient, or because it's more strong, it's more able to crush differences, internal infighting, than are the democratic systems. So the idea is that liberal democracy is not able to address the problems of the times. Is this still also the case today? I would probably argue that it is not, but it has strongly determined people's expectations for the near future at that moment, of course. A big leap now to the question of what can we do and maybe not do with the concept of fascism in a present day context. As you have probably also seen in this last slide with the map of Europe, there are fundamental differences between the present and the 1930s based on social and economic circumstances and political culture. The political culture of today is very different from the one of the interwar period. The economic situation of many people is very different from the 1930s, when unemployment rose to a very, very problematic level, and a large part of society were questioned if they would have enough to eat tomorrow. Of course, there are still people today that are in that position, but it was much, much more widespread. The general level of prosperity was a lot lower than it is today. These are fundamental differences. Also in the acceptance of democracy. I think today a democratic system is accepted by almost everybody in a certain way. To what way did they define democracy is a very different question. But the idea that democracy is good and that democracy should exist and that the country should be democratic is, I would say, supported by almost everybody. That was not the case in the 1930s. Is fascism flexible enough to exist in this present-day context? I would say yes, but it has to look different. It has to be different from the thing that we have seen in the 1930s. And the way to understand it is to look at this upper picture, this election poster of the Social Democratic Party in the Netherlands, the SDAP. It's not the NSDAP, it's the Social Democratic Party. That in a way still exists today, has a different name, it has evolved, and today it looks very different from this. So Social Democrats at the time, they wanted to look like this valiant worker fighting the octopus of capitalism. That's not a poster that they would use today. At the time, they were marching in uniforms as well. And if a present-day suit-wearing, very much present-day looking, moderate person can be a social democrat after first having used this kind of imagery, then maybe the same can be true of the fascist. So fascism does not need to wear leather boots and a swastika. He doesn't need to behave in the way Hitler behaved or Mussolini behaved. there's a translation to a different political culture that is possible for fascism too, while maintaining, of course, these characteristics of the definition that I've referred to. And this new definition provides analytical possibilities to recognize fascism in the present too. What has all of this to do with the present-day far right that has become a main source of power, a very powerful current in present-day politics? I would say there's a mixed answer to that. Certain elements of the definition are very present in the present-day far right. Nationalism and populism. I would say nationalism and populism are kind of the core ideology of the extreme right in Europe, in the United States, and in other places arguably as well. But some things are lacking or partially lacking. I would say there's much less revolutionary dynamic. There's much less of an agenda to have a fundamental transformation of society and of man on a grand scale in the way that fascists intended to. Many present-day far-right parties have less far-reaching final aims, although in some cases it can be debated if this actually is the case. So what I'm saying is not necessarily true. Feel free to disagree with me, especially when we're reaching a present-day political level. I'm not like the things I'm saying are not above the things that you are thinking. So be free to draw your own conclusions, please. This agenda of national rebirth, this idea of a fundamental national rebirth, is also a bit less present, I would say. Although there are also cases in the Netherlands too, where this is present actually. And then there's a refutation of legal limitation, of legal constraints. Generally, the far right has very little presence with the rule of law, with balances, and with legal restraints. But there's little glorification of violence, at least in Europe, I would say. Because in the United States, this looks partially different, where several movements have very much glorified violence, at least in recent years. So maybe not fascism, maybe the present-day far right is lacking something to be called fascist. Does that mean that it is fundamentally different? Maybe not, because there are several ways to bridge the gap. One way is just to make a Nazi salute, like Elon Musk has done, but there's other ways as well. Many far-right movements and parties actually have radical wings or semi-informal groups that operate a part of them, a side of them, but also kind of while being tolerated by them. And these groups often do develop these lacking elements. They do develop a glorification of violence. They do develop a revolutionary agenda or revolutionary aims. And they also do not shriek back from calling themselves fascists sometimes. These groups are kind of related to these parties, sometimes not officially, but they are part of the movement in a certain way. And then there are several ways of ideological radicalization. And one of these ways is provided by very influential conspiracy theories that you've probably already heard about, that are very powerful in the present day, like the so-called Great Replacement theory, which is actually a racist conspiracy theory based on the idea that elites are trying to destroy the white race or the white population of the country by bringing foreigners into the country, and that is a mortal danger to the people. If you really believe in this theory, the way, like the escalation to violence is very obvious and very present, I would say. There are several people in the current Dutch government who have said that they believe in this theory, which I would say is rather problematic. Because they open the door very wide to violent escalation and to political, ideological escalation as well. This is maybe a bit abrupt or a bit sudden end to this, but there's, I think, lots of time, I hope, for discussion and for questions. I want to make a bit of publicity for my own book, which you can say, I've never seen it as big as this, actually, in the corner there. It's in Dutch, so if you do read Dutch, it's available at all kinds of good bookshops, and it's not even expensive. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Daniel. My colleague has a microphone. If there's any questions, please raise a hand, and my colleague will come to you. We'll go here, then there, and please keep your hands raised in between.
Thank you so much for this lecture. I'm actually doing a master thesis in fascist discourse online, and I'm approaching a real problem with the terminology. I think it's worthy of using fascism as a term within that thesis, but there's just so many other terms that are used, like alt-right, far-right, dark enlightenment, red pill, just so many of these terms that kind of fragment this movement. And I just feel that, like, would I be doing a disservice to these movements by calling them fascist-leaning? Or, because it is true that not all of them have all of these tendencies, but there's definitely certain connections. So would it be a bad thing to accuse them of that, or like at least suppose that that is happening?
I think that's a very good question. Thank you for this. Like, what I would say is that by making the choice of treating fascism as primarily an ideology also means that you're paying more attention to certain interpretations than to others. And there's other very legitimate, very legitimate ways of looking at fascism, for example, as a kind of political behavior that leads to different answers. By making this choice to consider it primarily an ideology, I do intend to. I do end up with this kind of a look on fascism. The other terms that you mentioned, I'm not familiar. I heard about all of them, but I can say something about this far right and extreme right dichotomy that is often used. I'm not very convinced of the value of that, because the supposition is that the extreme right is against democracy, and the far right is within the democratic system, so it's just like it's pretty right-wing, but it is still part of the democratic process. I think it is actually impossible to make this distinction in reality, because these movements are always kind of both at the same time. They take part in the political system, but they also, their vision of the political future means the destruction of what many people would say democratic political system needs. And even fascists took part in the political process that did not make them democratic. So I would say that the difference between the far right and the extreme right is imaginary. They're too connected, and they're too much in movement to be separated from each other. Other categories are very useful as well, but I think this is the kind of the choice that I make, but that's very much related to my interpretation of fascism as an ideology.
Question over there, and now we'll go to the middle.
I have one horribly nitpicky question and one larger question. So nitpicky question is, the graph before did not include Austria as a fascist country in the 1930s. Is that because the sort of assumption is Austro-fascism was a kind of quasi or para-fascism and kind of just pretended to be fascist, while in reality we're just conservative Catholics? I'd be curious to hear more. And the other one is the relationship between masculinity and gender ideas to fascism. At least in my mind, there is a strong connection here between traditional and certain strong masculine virtues that are almost inherent, and certain views in which fascists tend to view gender and the role that gender and masculinity and the reassertion of masculinity play in that. I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think to start with the first question, I actually agree that Austro-fascism, that is the Catholic authoritarian system of rule in 1930s Austria, which was kind of, in the end, violently thrown away by the Nazi takeover during the Anschluss in 1938. Austro-fascism, I would call it actually fascist. So I do not agree with this map by putting it forward as a right-wing authoritarian regime. But there are different positions in this discussion as well, because it was very strongly inspired by Italian fascism. I would say that's the main reason for calling it fascist. The other question, the relation to masculinity and to outdated ideas about manliness and the gender context. Yeah, I think that is a very relevant aspect. I would not put it in the core definition, but it does play a very important role, also connected to social Darwinist ideas about survival of the fittest, about a vision of human relationships on a small and on a grand international level as dictated by the laws of Darwinist struggle for life. That also strongly implies that the strong should rule, and if they refuse to rule, they will die, they will perish, they will get eaten by others. And that also has a strong connotation to gender relationships. So I think that is a very relevant aspect.
Let's go to the middle, and then we'll move our way up, and then come back down.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is more regarding to the later topic of modern fascism that you mentioned. And I was wondering, so what I would consider modern fascists use the term of freedom a lot in their policy making. And if you have any thoughts about the relation between the term freedom and modern fascism.
Yeah, I would say that probably like old fascists also use the term freedom quite frequently. Of course, with a thwarted meaning. It meant kind of the national freedom to do whatever you want as a nation, as a collective of the people. Like this myth that the fascist leader or the fascist party directly in a very physical way represents the people also means that freedom is only expressed through a collective of the people. So it is not individual freedom, which was then discarded as something like liberal and 19th century and outdated, but it was kind of a national freedom, which does not mean that individuals were actually free. In the new far-right discourse on freedom, I do think it's used in a different way. It's used as a weapon against the state, but it's also used as a weapon against checks and balances. A weapon against the idea of pluralism. So in that way, I think it in the end also has certain similarities with the classical use of this fascist definition of what freedom should look like. So it's always freedom of a certain collective, and not on an individual level that can be defined as individual rights. That would be my answer.
Let's see, there were some hands up there, in the middle. Yeah, goes up first. Well, we'll go up first and then we'll go to the middle.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation, it was really interesting. I'm writing my bachelor thesis about meme culture and how it influences young voters' perception, and especially the right-wing perspective. I was just wondering what your take was on how racist and anti-Semitic and fascist meme culture, especially on Instagram Reels, can be lately, and how it's normalizing racism and fascism.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that you know more about this than I do, but I think it is very good that you study this phenomenon, because it has a big political significance. It is very politically important, especially if you look at the way people radicalize. The way people radicalize as part of online communities that exchange memes and jokes that end up, for certain people, end up being taken seriously. And I think this is a process that has been studied in the case of some very notorious mass murderers in recent years, where people started shooting all kinds of other people. They were often radicalized through these online communities that exchanged memes with sick jokes and with references to Nazism or references to the Holocaust, which for some of the participants were still sick jokes, but not taken seriously. But by some others had at some point started taking them seriously as political instructions. And there were actually even people who were shocked, like, this guy started actually believing it. Oh my God, I've actually contributed to this. So it even led to introspection for some people. But this process, memes play an important role in that. So I think I'm just not qualified to say anything about it, because I don't know it as well as you do, but I think it is very important, especially if you look at this from kind of a social scientist perspective. How does this process work? Which factors contribute to certain people, assumably people who are living in a more isolated or in a more isolated position, who don't have that much other people to communicate with, then radicalize to the point of becoming violent mass murderers.
If you're ironically spreading a meme, you're still spreading the meme.
Yeah, there's some of sick jokes that like I and some fellow historians sometimes do make, but I start feeling bad about this, you know. Yeah.
You gotta deal with it somehow.
Put my microphone off.
We'll cut that off. In the middle there, here. Naya.
In your presentation, we saw some pictures of the Le Pen family, so the famous far-right party in France. I have a question because in France, the latest elections, the age class that voted most for the Le Pen or like the Rassemblement, the National Rally, were the 18-24 years old people. So do you, like in your studies, do you see an increase in appeal for the far-right parties in the youngest generations? Because that's why, as a young French person, that's why I hear around me like the National Rally speech really appeals to young people, and I hear a lot of young people, well, not around me, but on social media, that are openly agreeing with this idea is something that would have not been acceptable like 20 or 30 years ago. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Like my idea would be that there are actually two things relevant to that. Like on one hand, it is relevant that young people have a different position. I think across Europe, young people are less under the influence of the old taboo of voting for the far right. You will not vote for the extreme right because they are kind of fascist and we will never have anything to do with them. That is the value of that moral disqualification is waning, and especially under the younger generations who are less personally or indirectly connected to the heritage of the experience of the Second World War. I think it is both regrettable and also understandable that it actually does happen. Like at some point, you know, these memories or these conclusions, they kind of do fade away. So it is maybe it's not something that I'm happy with, but it is understandable that young people here have a different position than to say pensioners, for example. On the other hand, I think like there's also after the last parliamentary election in the Netherlands, I think it came actually out that the youngest age group, or the people who were not allowed to vote, like between 12 and 18, that they would have voted in very large numbers for Forum for Democracies, led by Thierry Baudet, which is kind of I would say that they are arguably fascists. But didn't get any that much votes from the population at large. So but that was very much linked to TikTok campaigning, to very specific targeting of that age group, which other parties had not really invested in. In the last, in the Bundestag elections in Germany from last week, it became obvious, or it became clear that the youngest age group had actually voted in large numbers for Die Linke, which is the far left party. And then for the AfD, so the far right. So I would say that this young age group is also very much moving in all kind of directions. And I don't think it is a fundamental development, but in the terms of the taboo is falling or the taboo is fading away, I think young people are very much part of that. And that's of course what the FN, what the Front National, Rassemblement National very much wants to achieve.
There were some more questions in the top before. I'll move right down again.
Hello. Which current regime or regimes would you say most embody fascist principles?
Okay.
We're not going to show you all world leaders on the screen.
Yeah, I've done all these things with the definition and stuff, but I'm a bit afraid of becoming this kind of taxonomer. Who kind of is this real antique? Is this real fascist, or is this or not?
Let me get my buddy. He's an expert on fascism.
He will say the prize. No, but it's like which person or regime? The obvious choice would be to look at a few examples of far-right parties who do not shrink away from calling themselves fascist. I think there's a party in Slovakia that has no problems with that. The Greek Golden Dawn, now defunct, also did not really take much effort to distance themselves from historical fascism and National Socialism. So these would be the most obvious cases where there's no denial, or just a very shallow denial in place. Otherwise, I think you would always have to ask this question yourself, and it's kind of complicated. You could look at the Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, like Giorgia Meloni, who is the Prime Minister of Italy, is the leader of a party that considers itself post-fascist. Means that they've said, like, we're not fascist anymore, but we do recognize the heritage of fascism, and we are part of this heritage. And there's inspiring things in fascism that we do want to continue without, like, taking the whole thing for us or claiming the whole thing for us. If you take that at face value, you could say that this is one of the best examples. But then you would also have to look at what does the party actually want now, like how do they behave on a national, international scene, and then the picture becomes, I think, more complicated. So I'm afraid I do not have a top 5 or a top 10 or anything for you.
There's enough people with opinions on that. There was another question up there, and then we'll go down.
Thank you. I would say maybe the RSS in India, in regards to what you were talking about earlier, somewhat could be considered fascist. But my question was, many populists have been deemed fascists and vice versa, and I'm wondering what's your opinion on, like, what's the technical difference in your eyes between the two ideologies?
Okay, I would say that, the Indian case is very interesting, and I think the history of this party especially shows many links to fascism. And it also raises the question, like, how does fascism behave? If it is this flexible phenomenon that I've stressed, how does it behave in an Indian context? Also linked to the colonial history of the country, like the history of fighting off colonization, but also the influence of certain intellectuals who were actually admirers of fascism from the 1920s on, who were important in the history of the party that's now in power. But I know very little about it, so I can only say look at this grander kind of picture and not move in too much. Then, like, the main difference between populists and fascists would be, I think, like, linked to what I've treated but towards the end of my lecture, would be that in general populists have less far-reaching final aims than fascists. Populists want some kind of more direct democracy, and they want to have, like, the national people who are more in charge, but they're generally not looking for a complete revolutionary transformation of society and of the political system and of man, him or herself. So that's, I think, a difference that is maybe not systematic, but it is very present in many kind of what movements that get called populist. I'm not a big fan of using this populism category. I think populism is an ideological ingredient in the way that I've used it as part of this definition. I would say the far right or the extreme right are a broader category that is not necessarily fascist because it generally lacks these revolutionary characteristics and also this acceptance of violence, although that also is debatable in many cases.
I see the microphone has moved. Yes, go ahead.
Do you think that ecofascism is a modern thing, and how do you think it will evolve with the current climate change discussions?
Do you mean?
First, maybe shortly explain, ecofascism.
Yeah. Do you mean that the Green parties are fascist because they want some kind of eco-dictatorship, or do you mean that the embrace of ecological ideas by the far right is ecofascism, or both?
Actually, both. I read it about the right-wing parties, but also about left-wing parties or people who don't consider them left or right.
Yeah, it's historically interesting question. Fascists and Nazis were not the first to impose measures of natural protection, but they were very, like, at least the Nazis were kind of pioneering that as well. It could be argued that green politics should be actually logically more part of a conservative agenda than of a progressive agenda, although in reality it's not. So can be. There's a few examples of, but they're more marginal. But some marginal far-right movement that have embraced ecological discourse. It is also a little bit part of the neo-fascist movement in Italy, where they've embraced all kind of Lord of the Rings names and calling themselves hobbits and kind of be some kind of fascist hippie hobbit kind of thingy. So there is something going on. There's a few movements in Eastern Europe that have called themselves the people from the forest or something like that, like we are the nature that's fighting on the side of the ethnically pure people, kind of. So this discourse exists. So it can be part of it. But I would say, like in general terms, it is not. It's something different. It can be mobilized.
There were some questions over here. Let's do this, and then we'll move to the front.
Hello. Is the cover art for your book supposed to represent the Big Brother from 1984?
Good idea.
It reminded me of a Targets, like a Target board or that, but I was wondering if you had a say in what it looked like.
Now, but I think that the main answer, the reason for these circles is pretty boring because it is part of this Elementaire Deeltjes, so elementary parts series. It's like a very short introduction kind of book series, so it's all short booklets. And they all have these circles on them in different colors. So the one on identity, the one on populism, the one on Nietzsche, the one on vaccination, the one on anything. They all have, and for me, for some reason, they picked a very brownish, reddish, whitish. Yeah, I don't know why they did, but yeah. But this Big Brother, this kind of, this surveillance idea works. Yeah, never thought of it actually.
Interpretation is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
So there was a question over here, then there, then there.
Thank you very much. I have two questions actually. The first one is about, I think it was touched upon already, about left-wing parties, because I feel like we've been talking a lot like modern fascism in terms of like far right, but I feel like in terms of collective freedom, communism, those kind of things, they're more leftist ideas, or for example Marx. So how is that connected to fascism, whether it is older or more modern fascism? And then the second question is more about like the sovereigns who are making some uprise in certain parts of Europe, but also the rest of the world. And some of them, they don't become violent, but the others one do. So I was wondering if there's some kind of connection there as well.
Yeah, like why they, the sovereignists. You mean? The specific group. Yeah, to start with your, what was your first question again? Yeah, the left wing. Yeah, sorry. To start with that, there's actually also interpretations of fascism that stress that fascism is actually part of the left. It's a minority position, but it exists, and it's not completely nonsense, in the sense that what fascists actually wanted, this revolutionary transformation, this idea that like the whole system needs to be broken down, was at the time very much like associated with the revolutionary left. And there were also some revolutionary leftists, like Mussolini in his younger days, who became fascist. He was not the only one. So there's a broader movement of people who start on the far left and then go all the way, or maybe les extrêmes se touchent, as you also can even say in Dutch, because we have imported all these kind of French expressions. Like the extremes are not so far apart as they may seem. It's maybe makes maybe even more sense to go from one extreme to another than to go from an extreme to the very centrist position. So yes, there is a kind of left-wing connection to fascism as well, but I would argue that is in the end, the way it behaves, it is very much part of the right. It always considers the left its mortal enemy. It always starts repressing the left, persecuting them, killing them, humiliating them in the open, making life impossible for them, whilst doing business with conservatives and with traditional groups of power. So that's what fascists have done in reality, and that's, I think, a strong reason to look at it as not maybe mainly a left-wing phenomenon. Then the idea of totalitarianism, the idea of a collective, yes, they can be part of the left, and they have been part, very much so, of communist systems of rule. And that's a characteristic that is shared with them by fascism. But then also, if you look at what Marx actually said, like Marx would have never expected communism to have anything to do with collectivism or state oppression of personal freedom. So that is also a different context in which it was worked out, I would say.
Yes, one question to the front, one over here, and then we'll see if there's time left.
Hi, hello, nice.
Hi.
Okay, so thank you for sharing your knowledge, first of all. I wanted to touch upon the taboo fading that you were talking about before. So, background knowledge, I'm from Germany, so obviously this is like a really big thing, and personally I also feel like our culture of memory is a bit weird, because it's always about like, oh, this can never happen again, but we usually don't talk how can we make it never happen again. So, I feel like now with the election, I was wondering if we're kind of bound to always go back to those systems once in a while, as I think Plato has this like model of like a cyclical nature of once everyone becomes too comfortable with democracy, you kind of go back to like those types of system. So yeah, I was wondering what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I think it would be fatalistic to say like we are inevitably going back to fascism and to dictatorship, because that's the wheel of history that's turning around and there's nothing we can do against it. I do not believe in that. I'm very much not convinced of that. But what history does teach us, is always difficult to talk about the lessons of history as if they can be easily deduced or something, but I think what history does teach us is the openness of development, more rather that than a fixed model or a fixed cyclus of development. So things that were taken for granted when George Bush was proclaiming war against fascists, because he thought that it was obvious that Americans would always fight fascists, that the fascists were the arch enemies of anything that's American. I think that certainty has now faded away in the way the present United States and especially its leadership is behaving. So there is an openness to development, and we should not take too many things for granted, because then it will lead us to just go to bed and wake up in a world looking very different from the one we have expected and appreciated.
Yes.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
from everyone else here, so thank you very much for your talk. So what I was thinking about is the sort of iconography. The way we see fascists today, modern fascists, they never entirely went for the iconography of the Nazi Reich or Italy or wherever, but they always went for, the Confederacy, Southern heritage. They went for Rome or the Crusades. Until a few weeks ago, when at an inauguration, Elon Musk did a Hitlergruß. Do you think that's a one-of-a-kind thing, or do you think that sort of call for that kind of heritage is going to become more common and explicit?
Yeah, I'm not very convinced that nobody was using these symbols until Elon Musk decided to take this. It was really like amateur theater, right? He put his grim face and he stretched his arm, and it was really it was obvious what he wanted to impersonate. But before that, there were also movements in the United States that used swastika flags, that even called themselves Nazi, like by ignoring the fact that Nazi is actually a swear word used by non-Nazis. They're calling themselves Nazi. So yes, that has existed already, and I would also say that symbols like the Confederate flag have acquired a meaning that means actually that you're advocating for a racist slave-holding system. So it is also maybe not that much less of a radical symbol than an actual swastika flag. The meaning of the Confederate flag has also evolved. It was I think 20 years ago, it was kind of acceptable to use it when you are proud of being from the south of the United States, period. That is very much not the case anymore in its present day meaning. So the meaning of symbols can also change, I would say. But it is, in a larger sense, I agree with you that there is a tendency of taboos fading away.
Well, I think that is our time for today. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Please see you at one of the other events of SG, and please give one more round of applause once more for Daniel. Thank you.